Michael Krasny is the host of NPR's award-winning Forum, a cultural and news program that concentrates on the arts, culture, and business. Since 1970, he has been a professor at San Francisco State University in English literature. He has a PhD in English literature and is widely known as a critic, writer, and scholar. He contributes regularly to Mother Jones magazine, and he is the author of Spiritual Envy and Agnostic's Quest. He is also known as one of the country's top interviewers. He has interviewed such newsmakers and cultural icons as Jimmy Carter, Hillary Clinton, Cesar Chavez, Carl Sagan, Francis Crick, Rosa Parks, and Desmond Tutu. Don't you want to hear what this man has to say? He's also won numerous awards, including those for intellectual distinction and human rights journalism. Please welcome Michael Krasny.
Thank you. That was delivered so well that I thought you were reading off a teleprompter, and that was all from memory. Isn't that impressive? This is also an impressive group, I must say. I was saying without any inhibition that I have a feeling of a communal group here and a sense of everybody being very attentive and hospitable, and I thank you for that. In fact, I was just thinking about Robert Putnam's new book, someone whom I interviewed recently, a name you may know from his book Bowling Alone. He's a Harvard professor and pretty well-known and lionized professor at that. And in his new book, he talks about religion as having not quite the force, as you might imagine, given the secularization and given the kind of free-floating ideas that are going around and becoming a part of the new eclecticism, as I call it, with respect to people sort of shopping for different religious practices and different religious rituals that seem to satisfy them for the moment. In fact, there's more switching going on than there ever has been in terms of faith. But he was talking about just the community and the feeling of community that's often provided by church-going and by synagogue and mosque-going and all of that. And I think it's an important dimension to realize, especially when we talk about faith and when we talk about belief, which is what I write about to a great extent in this new book of mine, which I call Spiritual Envy. Why Spiritual Envy? The title is one that had kind of taken hold of me a number of years ago because I realized, well, first of all, envy is a pretty strong word to begin with. I think most of us will agree. And yet I felt that I really was envious of people who had a kind of spiritual anchoring. And I don't only mean people who had answers or who had a sense of tentative answers or who had been able to somehow find enlightenment or transcendence or a mystical experience or a road that they felt was leading them that way, but indeed felt that they were on some kind of trajectory toward spiritual enlightenment or felt that the practice of whatever it may be that they had taken up was leading them that way. And I didn't have that kind of enlightenment. I didn't have a path. And so I began, as someone who has always believed in the writing process, to take it upon myself to write about what I believed and to try to put it down or set it down. And thought that indeed, through the process, maybe illumination would come. If there's anything that I do hold as a kind of article of faith, it is that writing can bring enlightenment, that writing can even bring sometimes unexpected light. Joan Didion, who made her home down here in Southern California for the most part, writes about going into a tunnel when you write, and then light comes from one place and light comes from another place, and after a period of time you get a configuration of light that you hadn't even anticipated. And I was hoping for some of that in the writing process, and I think some of it indeed came to me in the writing process, because through this writing of this book at least, I discovered many things about myself. I went through a kind of self-inquisition. I discovered that many of the questions that had been central in my mind through much of my life, my adult life that is, that I had been seeking answers for, did not necessarily have answers. And I'm talking about what my publisher calls those 3 o'clock in the morning questions, you know, that you maybe tossed around a lot when you were university students. And particularly, many of you may indeed find yourself tossing about even to this day. Why am I here? What am I doing here? What about my mortality? What about good and evil? You know, trivial questions of that sort. So, and I began to find a kind of haven, I suppose, in agnosticism, because I thought to myself, you really don't know the answers to most of these questions. You don't know how you got here, and you don't know why you're here, and you don't really know necessarily how to determine how to find those answers, even though I consider myself, and I can say this because I think I'm at an age where I can say it without sounding vain, a learned man. And the more I learned through the years, the more I realized how bloody ignorant I was, and how much I didn't know. And the more I remembered my father's caveat to me as a young boy, don't be afraid to say you don't know. I thought, well, if Nancy Reagan could say about drugs, just say no, then Michael Krasny could say, just say I don't know, you know. Because although Jeff Mason, a philosopher whom you know, who's a member of this Inside Edge group, came up to me and said, I've got an article I want you to read on whether or not agnostics are cowards. And I thought this was particularly interesting in light of the fact that Studs Terkel, no less, the oral historian, said to me when I asked him, you're an agnostic, Studs, what does that mean to you? And he said, that means I'm a cowardly atheist. And there is a kind of acceptance of that notion that agnostics are cowardly atheists. Or if they're not cowardly atheists, they're just plain wishy-washy. They want it both ways. You know, they can't say there is no God, they can't say there is a God, so unable to embrace either one of those, they sort of stay in between, and yet maybe on the continuum lean more toward atheism or more toward some kind of belief or wanting to embrace a belief or find it. Actually, I think saying I don't know takes a certain amount of courage. And I believe that because all too often we're maybe almost inculcated to think that we should know answers. And we're almost conditioned into thinking that there are absolutes for us to discover, or that the absolutes are out there. And yet, there is in me a kind of natural resistance to the idea of absolutes. There's almost a kind of embracing in me, and always has been, of the notion of uncertainty. Uncertainty I see in, well, a kind of dichotomous way. That is, the certainty of uncertainty or the uncertainty of certainty. And I don't want to get into these kind of philosophical games here that begin to sound like woo-woo. But I think this, to some extent, as the great writer Ursula Le Guin once said to me in an interview, the only thing we can maybe be certain of is uncertainty. And what began to disturb me was that there are a lot of kind of hardcore atheists, many of whom I've interviewed now. And nothing wrong with being a hardcore atheist, except for the fact that there is a kind of certainty and almost fundamentalism with people like Christopher Hitchens, who I consider a friend and whom I admire a great deal, Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins. They're all very fundamentalist and almost evangelical, that is, proselytizing in their atheism. And I thought to myself, this is a kind of new militancy of atheism. And it's okay, but it made me feel uncomfortable in many ways, because I thought there again is that sense of absoluteness and certainty. And certainly we see that same absoluteness and certainty in many of the fundamentalists and many of the what we would call Bible thumpers, or people who feel they have an evangelical duty to impress upon us what they need to convert us to believe. And I thought, maybe there is some middle ground here. Maybe it's become too polarized, like partisan politics, and maybe we need to be able to speak to each other, believers and non-believers, and maybe open up a kind of dialogue here. And I found that I was really almost polemicizing, it begins to sound absolute in a way, for this sense of being able to come to some kind of middle ground, if there is a middle ground. And for me, it seemed to be an agnosticism. Now, agnosticism is something that has almost evoked, with good reason, I suppose, humor. There's the old Mort Sahl line about a family of agnostics moving into an all-white Christian neighborhood and someone burned a question mark on their lawn, and I began to realize that people, find agnosticism funny for so many reasons. Woody Allen used to say that there was an agnostic and an atheist, and they got married, and the marriage didn't work out because they didn't know what not to bring the kids up in. And suddenly I embarked on this odyssey of mine and started getting messages by email from friends of mine. I taught a course many years ago with a pretty well-known psychologist named Harvey Peskin, and he said, you're writing a book about agnosticism. Well, there's an agnostic mortuary called Remains to be Seen, and I'm thinking to myself, okay, there is humor here. And maybe, in fact, a number of years ago, I interviewed Eric Idle from Monty Python. He said to me, there are two forces in the universe. There's gravity and levity. And I thought, okay, there has to be some levity here. One can't take this too seriously, but I began to kind of gravitate myself between the seriousness of the subject and also the humor of the subject. The humor and the levity seems to sometimes fall just into the category of our helplessness in light of our mortality, our helplessness in terms of really feeling sometimes like we have the power over free will that we can exercise, and indeed we have free will, and I believe in free will. I remember asking the Nobel laureate Isaac Singer in an interview I did on stage, a very solemn young man I was, and early on in my career as an interviewer, and I said, do you believe in free will? And he said, I have no choice. But sometimes the universe seems to dictate to us, and I began to hear people saying things, especially some of my students would say things like, well, everything happens for a reason. And I began to recoil, and think, what does that mean, everything happens for a reason? It's a kind of faith, really. It's a notion that if terrible things befall, if there are tsunamis or hurricanes or whatever, there must be a reason, there must be a divine plan behind it, or something that makes it a fate that could be understood in the best of all possible worlds, or some Leibniz notion along those lines. And then I began to hear a lot of young people also saying, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. And I thought, what does that mean? And this, Derrida, the great deconstructionist, has a notion of what he calls the floating signifier. It's a word that is used in so many different ways that it begins to lose its meaning. It's like what Orwell wrote in Politics in the English Language. What does liberal mean? It begins to lose its force as a signifier because it's so overused and it's so, frankly, promiscuously used. So I thought, what does it mean to be spiritual? Where is spirituality lie? What do we mean by spirituality? And when I heard young people, and not only young people, but many people of my own generation saying things like, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual, I began to realize what they were talking about was seeking some higher transcendence or seeking some kind of truth that was manifold, that could direct them, or that they could understand in a way that would speak to what we talk about as our soul, if we have one. In my book, I said, I never found a soul in Gray's Anatomy, but we'll assume that we know what we're speaking about when we speak of a soul. And the idea of rejecting religion out of hand for some higher spiritual truth is becoming, in some ways, almost commonplace. The reasons are, I think, many. Religion as an institution has had some terrible failings, particularly in recent years. And this is why the strain of atheism has become, I think, as militant as it has. Because a lot of that strain of atheism has to do with the anti-religious fervor, an anti-institutionalized religion. 9/11 certainly, which in my mind, especially as someone who has made some serious outreaches into the Islam community in Northern California where I live, and I did this particularly after 9/11 because I felt there was a lot of demonizing of people of Muslim faith. 9/11 soured a lot of people on religion because 9/11 was done in the name of a new caliphate and all of these ideas that have become associated with Sunni Muslims for the most part, like Osama bin Laden. The fact of the matter is that this is a distortion of many of the religious principles, as at least they've come down to more moderate, nonviolent believers and people of faith, obviously. And the same holds true for the kind of reaction to, let's say, Jerry Falwell and Jimmy Swaggart and all of these religious evangelicals who were seen as hypocrites, who were disdained. There was a lot of anger about the Bush administration, particularly from progressives and people on the left, being too religious and being too tied to notions of God and so forth. All of this seemed to turn off, especially a lot of young people. And Putnam writes about this in his book as well, when he goes around gauging and getting attitudes that are prevalent today. And so what I found myself, curiously enough, working out in this book of mine was a different kind of synthesizing where religion was concerned as well. Because I think that organized religion has, no one would deny, led to, or what was been done in the name of organized religion, some terrible and frankly dreadful and horrible things. I mean, we think about the Crusades and the Inquisition and so forth. I think people talk about pedophile priests. There's a lot of disaffection and a lot of alienation because of all that has been done in the name of religion, or all that's become associated with religion. But as somewhat of an intellectual historian, I began to think about, especially from an American cultural and American civilization standpoint, all the things that organized religion can also be associated with, which, frankly, abolition movement, civil rights movement, the solidarity movement in Poland, the liberation theology movement in Latin America, which has led to a lot of amelioration of poverty. But on a personal level, I also began to think to myself, because I did work with prisoners in San Quentin at one time, began to think about those prisoners who found through religious belief a way out of recidivism. And I began to think about people who found themselves believing in a higher purpose as friends of Bill, in Alcoholics Anonymous or in some narcotic addiction anonymous group, where they would find a way through faith, not necessarily organized religion, but through a higher belief, out of their addiction. And I found myself in a curious way that I hadn't anticipated, making a kind of brief for looking at religion from both sides. That is, realizing that religion can give people hope and solace and provide them with peace in their lives. We've heard, in fact, in the writing of this book, strangely enough, and I hadn't anticipated this, an involuntary memory came back to me, what Proust would call an involuntary memory. And it was of a song that was popular. Some of you a little long in the tooth like I am may remember this. It was a world-famous song by Elvis Presley, an old gospel song called Crying in the Chapel. And the lyric was, "You saw me crying in the chapel, the tears I shed were tears of joy. I know the meaning of contentment now. I'm happy with the Lord." Boy, happy, peaceful, content. This is what most of us are looking for in this life, and there it is in a kind of ecumenical chapel, at least in the song, with God. Well, if you're an agnostic and you have doubt and skepticism your whole life, as I have had, and you can't necessarily feel God in an emotional way, and there is that inner terrain of God. A friend and colleague of mine, Jacob Needleman, who has written a book recently on God, speaks about external empiricism and internal empiricism. I could never align with the internal empiricism, just couldn't do it. I wanted to. I would have liked to have made a leap of faith, or I would have liked to have found that sense of transcendence or higher meaning. Just couldn't do it, so I remained a skeptic and remained a doubter, and had to kind of get that down and prose, and had to somehow relinquish myself of it the way one does when one embarks on writing a book. At the same time, I was able to come to certain kinds of realizations about what doubt means. I read a British novelist named Julian Barnes who said, "I don't believe in God, but I miss him." And I was really hit with that. I mean, it resonated emotionally for me, right in my viscera where I live. Because as a boy, I felt assured of God's existence. As a boy, I felt that God was watching over me, and my mother told me, he's even marking down the white lies you tell, everything. He's got a big book, and in it, and if you tell, bad lies or even little lies, they go down in that book. And God was this force in my life, and someone in a cathartic way I prayed to every night. He was also someone who was capable of punishing me. When I was about 14 years old, a kid who lived in a neighborhood near me invited me over, and he had a pool table. This was considered wealth in those days, from the neighborhood I grew up in, and he had all kinds of other things, including what he introduced me to in his parents' bedroom closet, which was pornography. And they had a big shoebox, and here was pornography. Now, of course, it's ubiquitous on the internet, and unless you get the kind of protection from your children getting to it, it's, I'm afraid, pretty accessible. But not in those days. And then he said, "I'm going to show you something else that's in the shoebox of my parents, but you have to swear on your mother's life that you will not say anything to anybody about what I'm going to show you." Well, obviously, after seeing this pornography, I couldn't imagine what was next. So, and being a boy of strong curiosity and testosterone, I swore on my mother's life that I would. And what he showed me pictures they were Polaroid pictures that his father had taken of his mother in various stages of undress and finally no dress at all. And his mother was what the kids nowadays call a MILF, which is an acronym for a mother I'd like. Well, anyway, I don't want to offend anybody here, so I won't use that F-word bomb, but you get the idea. I had sworn on my mother's life that I wouldn't say anything. And I thought, I could never say anything. I mean, it was that strong in my head and heart, both. And for whatever reason, I never did until after my mother died. I mean, you have these things that are so ingrained in you, these kinds of superstitions. Call them superstitions if you like. The other day I was sitting at a lunch with a friend of mine. He spilled some salt, and I took the salt and spilled it, put it over my shoulder. I thought, why am I doing this? Oh, my mother did it. My father did it. It's supposed to ward off evil or whatever it's supposed to do, and so you continue doing it even though you're not a believer anymore. But the beliefs that I did have, I held in a sacred way. I held very deeply in my heart as a boy. And to lose those kinds of beliefs is to lose something that one really cherishes. I mentioned Derrida earlier on. I didn't know I'd be mentioning him twice today, but a lot of people associate a phrase with Derrida, the deconstructionist, post-structuralist, who taught down here for years, as some of you probably know. He talked about the presence of absence, which actually isn't his phrase, it's James Joyce's. But there's the sense of that presence of absence I think most of you can relate to and understand. When you lose somebody you love, you have what is described, I think, so aptly as the presence of absence. And the presence of absence of God is something that was very real to me. It was palpable to me. I had known God. He was, as I said, someone who was very preeminent in my life as a young boy. And I lost him for the usual reasons that one loses God, wanting to be an intellectual, reading Darwin and Spengler and Schopenhauer and Nietzsche particularly. That'll do it. But as I began to read in a deeper way and in a more thoughtful way, I realized there was something else that was going on. And that was the idea, the anthropomorphic idea we have of God as someone who, as talking about on a throne with a white beard, all that patriarchal imagery that we have, that God has a force in our lives, that God has a direct relationship in our lives, is connected to us. And reason didn't allow me to believe that. Reason said to me, there are too many people I know who are sleeping well at night who shouldn't be sleeping well at night. There are too many people who are doing good who are suffering. How could God watch over everything? Is he watching over the godless communists, I asked myself as a high school student? The kinds of questions that now almost seem Blakean, in their innocence to me. And that I continue to reflect on and hope that I will continue to reflect on because, as Einstein says, never stop asking questions. But here's what happened to me as a young boy, which is important in this whole story, which is partially my story. I had a sixth grade teacher in a public school who was from the British private school. That was his background as a teacher, as an instructor, historically in his life as a teacher. And I was a kid who was maybe even hyperactive. I don't know, they have names for these things now, ADD or whatever, ADHD. Anyway, he would get upset at me, angry at me, annoyed at me, whatever, and he would take me by the ear, literally, into the boys' restroom across the hall and slap, kick, punch. There was one occasion where the head went right into the toilet and held it there. I mean, I'm not telling you this to shock you or anything. When you go through this kind of trauma as a young boy, at least my experience is, and I tell people this, you just have to move on. You can't, let it sink into your pores or deflect you from whatever your purpose is in life or whatever you're moving toward in life. And I didn't. However, when I began to read, particularly Dostoevsky, who raises the question in a very salient way and says, if God does not exist, anything is permissible. And what he's talking about in The Brothers Karamazov is a boy, a child, being beaten. And suddenly it clicked in my mind, and I thought to myself, that's the kind of God that I was raised to believe in. because when I got the most ferocious beating from this particular teacher, I had been on a new track of trying to be a good boy, but I had spilled some paint by accident. I write about this in my introduction to Spiritual Envy. And there's this paint going down the corridor. I was just taking it to another teacher's classroom, like a miniature river. And he comes out to have a cigarette in the restroom and sees this paint and sees me standing there looking forlorn and shamed and all that, and thus precipitated the worst beating of them all. Well, for a young boy from a working class neighborhood, the thing was never to show emotion, and so I'm mopping up the paint at his ordering me to do so, and keeping in the tears, and then going out and going into a little area near where I lived, had some trees and stuff, and just sobbing. And I tell you this story because I was all of 11 years old, and I never told my parents about these particular beatings that I endured, mainly because he was the teacher, and I was a kid who was given to mischief. I just would have thought I was going to be more of a bad boy. I told my parents years later, and they were horrified. But I remember sobbing and saying in my head, nobody knows how good I was trying to be, but you do, God. There was that sense. God knew. And not only did God knew, he oversaw everything, and he understood. Right? And to lose that sense of that kind of presence, to feel that presence is no longer being present but being absent, is a real loss, and a loss that I think many of us in our adult lives are trying to figure out how can we fill it, how can we compensate for it, especially if there's some kind of spiritual longing or spiritual hunger or a sense of wanting something more than what one has. And so this book is an attempt to grapple with those kinds of questions and to realize that faith makes life a lot easier. Some of you may remember Rose Kennedy, after the assassination of her second son, Robert Fitzgerald Kennedy. She had two sons gunned down, sat there and said, well, I have my faith. Faith can sustain a great deal. I don't know that it can move mountains, but it can certainly provide people with a great deal of what we need to face suffering and to face the vicissitudes of life. I don't have it. And like I said, I lost it, and I thought it's enviable as something to have in one's life. So what can one take to replace it? Because envy doesn't work. Envy can only go so far. Envy is, in fact, one of the 7 deadly sins. Drop a name here. She's on the back of my book. Isabel Allende, who happens to be a friend of mine, said, there are really, Michael, there are really only 2 of the 7 sins that are deadly sins that are really interesting and that I really like, and that's gluttony and lust. That's Isabel Allende's sense of humor, sort of epitomized. So, yeah, you have this feeling of spiritual envy. What do you do with it? Well, you write a book, but in addition to that, I found myself doing what I do on a daily basis in a radio studio, and that is asking questions that I feel need to be asked. And there's an old joke about, like, why does a psychiatrist always answer a question with another question? Why shouldn't the psychiatrist answer a question with another question? Questions lead you to more questions, and they don't necessarily lead always to answers, but in the questions, there's light. I like to think that what I do on a daily basis as a broadcast journalist is bring light. You listen to people like Rush Limbaugh or Michael Savage or Sean Hannity. They bring some light, but they bring a lot of heat. And that's why their ratings are way up there. I try to bring light, and indeed, again, using that metaphor of Joan Didion and the tunnel and so forth, a lot of what this book is about is precisely that. And I thought to myself, boy, talk about radio hosts. Glenn Beck always talks about the Founding Fathers, so there's a peril in even mentioning the Founding Fathers can be associated with Glenn Beck. But there is a sense of the importance of what they believed, too, that came home to me, because they were deists for the most part, just like Voltaire was. They thought well, God created the heavens and the earth perhaps, but then he went MIA on us, or she did, or whatever. And I don't know if that's the case. I don't know how this world we live in, let alone the cosmos, as much as we know about them, and we don't know a lot. We know, that there are galaxies and galaxies, right? It shows us how much we don't know when we think of interstellar space, or even the ocean and the depths of the ocean, right? But when you think about what your purpose here is, and what your life is all about, and whether or not you can find meaning, maybe the quest itself, maybe the search itself is what it's ultimately all about. And that's where agnosticism makes sense to me. Because agnosticism has a long and really in many ways heralded tradition of being tied to skepticism in many cultures, both East and West. And by skepticism, I mean, think of Socrates, who said, the only thing I know is that I know nothing. It's not only Hellenistic, it's also Hebraic, it's Asian, it's all over the world. It's universal, that idea of skepticism, not cynicism, but skepticism and not knowing, and being able to say that you don't know and that you don't have answers. When I wrote this book, a friend of mine was a very wealthy man, kind of a Midas touch. Everything he's done has brought him great wealth. We had lunch. He said, oh, no, Michael, you're writing another scholarly book with no answers? Don't you know that people want answers? They're not going to buy your book if you don't have answers. Well, the truth of the matter is, I came to a place in this book that made sense to me, that was a synthesis of so many ideas. And so in a real way, what I didn't realize was that the book itself was an act of faith. Like perhaps many of you, I found myself at one time in my life being drawn to nothingness. Camus made a great deal of sense to me when I first read him, and most of the existentialists did, but particularly Camus, who said, you want to know what eternal nothingness is? Think of what your life would mean 5,000 years from now. It's a pretty heavy-duty cognitive thing to grapple with, right? But nothingness didn't work really either, and I began to think that those who I idolized, like Beckett and being a splendid example, and I thought really he's right about the human condition. It's one of waiting. I think Waiting for Godot, one of the most important works of the 20th century, is a book about waiting, a play about waiting, and life is mirrored in that play. It's a poetic image of the human condition. But Beckett, all his nihilism notwithstanding, was someone who kept creating works of literature, kept creating plays to be staged, who fought in the underground against the Nazis. Camus also fought in the underground. In other words, they were political, they were committed, they were artists. So Sartre, being in nothingness and yet, wrote all these great plays and works of literature as well. It kind of contradicts the whole idea of nothingness. Nothingness was a good armor to wear as a young man because it sort of protects one and it's romantic and cerebral and all that. But nothingness, I remembered my mother's old cliche, sweetie, something's better than nothing. And began to think to myself, of course you're not a nihilist. You don't believe in nothing, right? Democritus said nothing means more than nothing, but there are things that you value and cherish despite what your life may mean 5,000 years from now. And when we go back into the origins of time and try to think of, was there a fine-tuner? Was there some kind of cosmological beginning or inception, whatever? I don't have an answer. A lot of the atheists will say, well, we don't have answers either. And in fact, Richard Dawkins made a whole continuum of atheist belief. But they get rattled at the idea that you can just say, I don't know. Stephen Hawking, as some of you know, just published a book, in fact, recently. And Hawking called himself an agnostic for a while. In fact, a lot of people call themselves agnostics. Jane Smiley, who is a Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist and also a friend, said to me recently, well, I used to be an agnostic, but now I'm an indifferentist. I just don't care, So it's all right, that's a good religion. Right? There's nothing wrong with being an indifferentist. And Hawking said, I used to be an agnostic, but now I'm an atheist. Why am I an atheist? Because we had this ongoing battle where we said we don't know what was before the Big Bang. And we can't tell what was before the Big Bang. Therefore, we don't know. And we have to say we don't know. And agnostic means not having knowledge. goes back to T.H. Huxley, a man who was Aldous Huxley's grandfather and who was known as Darwin's bulldog. And I wanted to kind of bring back these agnostic philosophers, T.H. Huxley, Bertrand Russell, who sometimes called himself an atheist, and a man named Robert Ingersoll, whose name has been lost in that. He was known as the great agnostic. So Hawking comes out with a book and he says, I'm an atheist now because we know what preceded the Big Bang now. It was gravity. Hawking's one of the most brilliant minds on the planet. But I thought to myself, what preceded gravity? I mean, gravity does exist after all. So, was there some kind of divine notion that got us all started? I don't know. I just don't know. And when atheists often, as they do, say, well, you know, you can believe in Santa Claus, you can believe in the Easter Bunny, you know, it's really the same kind of thing as believing in God. Something in me recoils. Because the whole foundation of the civilization that we live in, whether we like it or not, what we call the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, is based on a precept of a higher power. Now, what that higher power is, or even if that higher power exists, I don't know. And I think, it, as I said, it takes a certain modicum of humility and maybe even valor to simply say, I don't know. Our Puritan forebears here in this American civilization came here with the idea of religious tolerance, even though they persecuted witches and they persecuted Indians. And we've had this rather bizarre bifurcated sensibility in America of being a land of free worship and tolerance toward all religions at the same time that there's been some invidious religious bigotry and persecution. But one could hardly find a country more given to a work ethic and to a work ethic based on precepts that go back to Calvinism, really, you know, and religious Calvinism at that. So all I'm saying to you is it's a mixed bag. Right? It's a kind of binary. You know, you have the good side of religion and you have the bad side of religion. And you have all the good things that have been done in the name of God, and you have all of the dreadful and horrible things that have been done in the name of God. And I found myself in this book and in blogging, and there's a recent one in the Washington Post that I did, and there's another one in Huffington Post that I did, crying out from a kind of agnostic wilderness and saying, like Rodney King, can't we all just get along? Can't we speak to each other? Can't believers and non-believers actually have discourse and dialogue and ask each other questions and come to grapple with ideas that are worth grappling with without imposing and without coercing and without trying to compel? Recently I had the privilege of interviewing Salman Rushdie, whom I've interviewed a number of times. Been quite a few changes through the years, as you might imagine. The first time I interviewed him was when he wrote a book called The Jaguar Smile, and he had been to Nicaragua. The next time I interviewed him, he was with a bunch of bodyguards. He was under the fatwa. Now, he doesn't travel with bodyguards anymore. He's in my studio just a week ago. And I said, well, you become an atheist? And he said, yes. And in fact, he had a splendid quip about Christopher Hitchens' book, God is Not Great. He said, he read the book and he said, you could take out the last word of the title. It's called God is Not, because it's a brief for atheism. And, you know, Hitchens now, by the way, I will get back to Rushdie in a minute, but Hitchens now has esophageal cancer and he's dying, and it's very, very sad and troubling. As many people are praying for him as are praying, well, they're praying both ways, actually. So, and Hitchens has said, look, if I say I found God like some kind of Brideshead Revisited last moment, you know, and everything, it's the chemo and the radiation. I have nothing, you know, I mean, he's obdurate to the end in his atheism, and you have to respect that, as I do. But we were talking about Hitchens, Rushdie and I, because he and Hitchens are close friends. And I said, well, you've become an atheist. He said, yes, but he said, unlike Christopher, he said, I feel people should believe and worship in any way they want. I don't care, you know, whatever they want to believe. I mean, if it gives them peace, hope, solace, so much the better. He says, when religion goes into the public spheres and when religion tries to determine policy, that's where I have problems, and that's where I have difficulties. And I like that division between the private and the public vis-a-vis religion, because we always have been, at least a nation that separates church and state. It's in our Constitution. I guess the woman who ran in the Tea Party in Delaware didn't know that, but that happens to be the case. So if I sound like I'm giving a little homily here, or kind of a sermon, my apologies for that. But I do believe in religious tolerance. I do believe that religion is a many-faceted, especially organized religion, phenomenon that we have to understand historically in those many dimensions. And I would add that it's okay to say simply, I don't know. Now, one of the things I've discovered as a result of talking about this book and the book being out there in the world is that people like to tell their stories of faith and religion and what they've grappled with, or what they continue to find themselves grappling with, especially in terms of spirituality. We've got about maybe 5 minutes. Could I open things up and maybe get some responses from you? And maybe indeed, if there are any questions that this content has served to be a catalyst to, that you might want to ask? Jeff?
Microphone. This question about doubt. Pascal wrote this thing about, how could you possibly have a friend who is a doubter? Because what a horrible person that person must have been. Because how forlorn, how full of fear they must be. But, there's, like you say, there's a lighter side to agnosticism where it's the joy of doubt. Why the pain? Why all the fear? Skepticism is, you're free if you're a skeptic. You're not held down by all these beliefs. Mm-hmm. So why the emphasis on doubt and doom and gloom?
Actually, I agree with you. I think that doubt can bring joy, and I also think that doubt can. Well, I quote Tobias Wolff in my book, who says doubt is part of faith, and I mean not for true believers, not for that hardcore what Corinne Armstrong calls the fundamentalist true believers and so forth, but I think that doubt, and you see. Aquinas and so many of the great theological thinkers grappling with doubt and wrestling with doubt in a very deep and profound way. But sure, a source of joy, absolutely. I agree. It is liberating. I like the way you frame that, in fact. Yeah.
Okay, I'm Jane.
Oh, hi, Jane. I'm
Hi,
sorry.
Thanks. Okay, please don't take this question wrong.
Oh, that's a preface of...
God. Okay, so why would I buy your book? What is in it that what's the ultimate essence in a few sentences or a few paragraphs of what would compel me to buy your book?
Well, I think, it's a question that puts one on the spot because one doesn't like to sell my own book, but I think there is a search in there, there's a quest in there that's mine personally, but that also resonates universally. Certainly. Pardon? Well, no, I think, here's the thing that I've discovered actually. Books are Rorschachs, they're kind of ink blots often, and people derive from books all kinds of different things. I have found people who have read this book who have, in fact, it surprised me not only that they found answers, because it delighted me too, but what surprised me particularly was the answers that they found in the book. They found answers that offered them, in many ways, a synthesis of ideas, a peacefulness of ideas. Look, if you're asking the right questions, they can lead you either to answers or to more questions. And I believe, above all, that I'm asking the right questions here. I'm asking questions that are tough and that come out of a very uncompromising sensibility. Am I saying that I have intellectual integrity? Yes, I think I am. I'm sorry if that sounds immodest, but yes. Sorry. Oh, I should look for the microphone, shouldn't I? Yeah, yes. I'm sorry.
Well, look, I'll make I have an answer for you. I think because I don't have to be modest because I'm not you. I think the core idea is there's great value in saying I don't know. and that I would say there's tremendous pressure in our culture to not say, I don't know.
Exactly.
So there's one thing. But well, I tell you, I see, regarding myself, I guess I would say I'm a Taoist in the sense that if I stand on a cliff looking at the ocean and I see the pattern of the waves, so there's pattern, or I'm a patternist, or immanent. So it's easy for me. I don't have the torture of the guy whispering in my ear is there or not there. He was never there. But the sense of, and then so my job is to be a good surfer, adapted to the pattern. So anyway, so I'll call that Taoism. Thank you.
I also call that pragmatism. That sounds like good American pragmatism. But getting back to your question and sort of synthesizing from what this gentleman just said, there's a lot of synthesis of ideas in this book, and there's a good deal of maybe too much weight on learning and where it can lead you, and it often leads you to, as I said, just continuing to ask more questions. I like what you said, though, about the waves and so forth. There are people who come to me and they say, well, nature, to me, reflects some higher transcendent purpose. I commune with nature, or I feel a communion with nature, or I connect with it. And it almost sounds like pantheism or something along those lines, Whatever it is for you, you should experience it, I think, in a joyful way, getting back to our resident philosopher here and what he brought up. Let me just say something about this, because what we're really talking about here, if you deconstruct it, is the meaning of life, which none of us necessarily have any absolutely axiomatic answers to. However, at one point I found myself, the playwright James Earl Jones, that name, who wrote Ma Rainey's Black Bottom and Fences and won a number of Pulitzer Prizes, African-American playwright. He was dying, and he was dying of pancreatic cancer. And some intrepid reporter asked him, well, you've got a very small amount of time left. Your cancer's pretty vicious. What are your thoughts as you reflect on your life, as you're heading off to the last sunset, whatnot? Reporters do ask those kinds of questions, And he knew he only had maybe a couple months left, and it actually turned out to be less than that. And he said, I've lived a blessed life. And I remember being so moved by that, because I thought to myself, whether you believe in blessings or not, or whether you believe, one should be grateful for blessings, or where do blessings come from, or how do they emanate to us? To feel that way about having lived your life, I think, is saying a great deal. In fact, it seems to me it's about as good as it gets. Yeah, sorry.
Thank you very much. I really enjoy your thinking and your view of not knowing. And
Thank you.
I'm intrigued by nothingness, and actually I think that's why I'm so intrigued by Buddhism and Buddhist thought, because of course nothingness is very important within Buddhism, and the interesting thing I think is that if you really give yourself to nothingness, it becomes extremely rich.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, I was very drawn to Buddhism too, and again, I write a lot about Buddhism in this book, because you're right that what is nirvana? It's an extinction of consciousness. It's nothingness, and that's what one aims for in the highest, whether it's Mahayana or Hinayana Buddhism, the highest sense, if you're going to frame it theologically. In fact, Buddhists are atheists. Many Buddhists I know are atheists. They don't practice that old polytheistic Buddhism, and there are many things that are attractive about Buddhism, especially the teachings of compassion and mindfulness and loving kindness and all of those kinds of virtues. It didn't work for me, though. And I think the problem is that, probably like some of you, I find that an organized ideology or an organized way of thinking, something to vest my belief in or convictions in, whether it's political ideology or religion, simply doesn't hold enough water for me personally. Maybe I expect too much. I don't know. But anyway. Yes. Thank you. Thanks very much.